Hello everyone, we continue with Chapter 1, Part 4 today. August 1864. After the fight at the inn, I was able to leave the compound much more often. I suppose after what I'd done, Hijikata thought I'd earned a little more trust. I didn't feel like I'd done anything that extraordinary, but I wasn't about to look a gift horse in the mouth. On this particular day, I was out on patrol with Harada and the 10th Division. "Excuse me, Harada? The Shinsengumi's out patrolling day and night, right? But what exactly is it that you do?" Most of the men in the Shinsengumi were intimidating, death-dealing titans, but Harada was a rare exception, warm and friendly. "Well, I guess we do just about everything," said Harada. "Obviously we arrest people who decide they want to test out their swords on the townsfolk, and we go after people who steal or don't pay for their food. Sometimes we break up fights." People who don't pay for their food? "And then there are those chumps who think they'll make a living leaning on the merchants. We take care of all of that." It wasn't really the answer I'd expected. Most of the stuff they did wasn't nearly as dramatic as I'd thought. As I thought back, I remembered how excited they'd all been when they were preparing for the raid on the Ikeda Inn. Now I understood why. What they'd done at the inn was a good deal more intense than their day-to-day work. A little further down the road, a couple men in Shinsengumi blues were waving at us. "Nagakura!" Our separate rounds had brought us to the same spot. "Hey there, Chizuru," said Nagakura. "You find anything out about your dad?" I shook my head. "No, nothing today." "Oh, come on, cheer up. There's always tomorrow, right?" Yeah, you're right." There was something contagious about his optimism. "Well, Shinpachi," said Harada, "you find anything exciting?" "No, nothing in particular, but, well, all of the people on the street are acting busy, you know." I hadn't noticed it before, but he was right. They were acting strange, almost nervous. "Yeah, it looks like they're getting ready to move." Harada nodded. "You think maybe they're worried about getting caught in the middle of a war?" said Harada. "What? War? There wasn't a war, was there?" "Oh, you didn't hear," said Nagakura. "Well, those Choshu bastards are showing up around Kyoto again. That's why we've got extra watchers these days." "Well," said Harada, "we did give him a bit of a bloody nose at Ikeda. I can't imagine they'll just stand around with some of their guys in the ground." Were the Choshu going to try something again? The Shinsengumi were doing their best to keep order in Kyoto. In fact, they'd saved the city from the rebellious plans of the Choshu once before, with their victory at Ikeda Inn. But even after all they'd done, the people of Kyoto looked at the Shinsengumi with fear and distrust, and plenty of them still sided with the Choshu. The Shinsengumi were better regarded now than they had been before Ikeda, but even so. I told Nagakura as much, but he only laughed. "Not much we can do about that. Kyoto hates the shogun." "It doesn't matter anyway," said Harada. "We just do our job. The Choshu attack Kyoto, we drive 'em back. Simple." They accepted their situation and never complained. I had a good deal of respect for Harada and Nagakura. "If they don't back off soon," said Nagakura, "we're probably going to be getting new orders all the way from the top." For the Shinsengumi, the top meant the Aizu domain. "It's that serious, huh?" Harada gave a bark of laughter and nodded. "Well, chances like this only come around every so often. Who knows when the next one will be? You want to join us?" "What? Join?" Did he mean for me to join the Shinsengumi and march to war with them? I couldn't imagine joining them would be as simple as saying, "Yes, please." Besides, it seemed rather inappropriate for me to ask to participate just so that I might satisfy my curiosity. Still, I did want very much to be helpful in some way. Could I perhaps do something like what I'd done at the Ikeda Inn? Even if I could, though, I was terribly frightened of being anywhere near a battle. On the other hand, the men who'd been injured at Ikeda were still out of commission. The choice here is, I want to come or I will stay behind. And I choose I want to come. My mind was made up. I looked at Harada and nodded. I want to help. Several days later, "Excuse me." Carefully I lifted the serving platter with its tea for the captains and made my way to the common room. It had taken me longer than it should have to make the tea, so I was a little worried some of it had gotten cold. "Thanks, Chizuru," said Nagakura. "Man, it's almost like you're our servant or something." I wasn't entirely sure how to respond to that, so I stayed silent as I handed out the tea. "Thank you, Yukimura," said Inoue. "I feel bad asking you to do this." "Oh, it's nothing. After all, you're always looking out for me." And besides, I felt much better when I had something to do. It kept me from feeling too much like a freeloader. Okita took a sip of his tea and a mild grimace flickered across his face. Is it too bitter?" He shook his head. "No," said Okita. "The taste is fine, but it could stand to be hotter. Then again, I suppose this sort of tea fits you." Sorry." There was a second or two of silence before the door flew open and Kondo strode in, a stern look upon his face. "The Shinsengumi has received an official request from the Aizu domain. All available soldiers are to begin preparations to move out immediately." The room broke out into cheers. "It seems the Aizu have finally noticed all the hard work we've been doing, men." He looked just as happy with the news as the rest of them. Apparently getting orders directly from the Aizu domain was an occasion for some excitement. Hijikata, however, was the lone exception. "We don't have time for this shit," said Hijikata. "Stop patting each other on the back and get moving. We need to go now." He went on to explain that the soldiers of the Choshu had already spent some time preparing for their own attack. So they only realize there might be a problem when the Choshu are ready to attack Kyoto? This is bullshit, said Hijikata. Hijikata certainly seemed unhappy about the direction things had gone, and I could understand, at least to some extent, how he felt. If the Aizu had asked for help earlier, then the Shinsengumi would have had much more time to prepare. Okita and Todo, said Sanan, you will remain here at the compound. I doubt you find this a welcome order, but, well, neither do I. He rubbed his left arm absently and looked away. Your injuries keep you from active duty, as does mine. I didn't think there was any chance that hadn't made Heisuke and Okita feel at least a little guilty, but... Hey, said Okita, I'm completely healed. I might not be 100% yet, but I'm not bleeding or anything. He acted almost as if he hadn't heard Sanan at all. You're making a big deal out of nothing, said Todo. This is just a scratch. Kondo's being a wuss. Perhaps they were so used to Sanan feeling sorry for himself that they had simply ignored his comment. Perhaps it was time I learned to do the same. You sure about that? Said Harada. Last night the pain had you crying like a baby before you took your medicine. Oh, you son of a bitch, said Todo. Why you got to rat me out? Is there even a heart in there, you old bastard? It seemed Heisuke's injury hadn't healed quite as much as he'd claimed. Maybe, said Harada, maybe not, but you know, I'm telling the truth. Yeah, said Todo. Well, you don't have to say it in front of a girl, you know? He glanced sideways at me. Oh, don't worry about me. Everybody gets hurt. His bangs hid the scar rather well, but it still looked painful. There was a moment of silence, and then Nagakura spoke. Oh, yeah. Chizuru, you said you wanted to go with us if we got called in, right? You still up for that? Oh, yes, I had said that, hadn't I? Well, I knew it couldn't be so simple as just asking to go. Ah, yes, said Kondo. Well, I see no reason why not. After all, it isn't often that one is given such an opportunity. What? I hadn't expected Kondo to agree so easily. Wah, said Todo. Well, you sure got lucky, Chizuru. Make sure you do us proud, all right? Do us proud? Hijikata glanced at me and sighed. We can't promise you won't get hurt or worse, said Hijikata. You should stay here. Do you wish to place undue burden on the Shinsengumi? Asked Sanan. War is not something one does to ease one's boredom. His cold smile was anything but comforting. Colonel Sanan, said Saito, can I take that to mean that so long as she is not a burden, she is free to accompany us? I blinked. Saito standing up for me? Sanan seemed nearly as surprised as I was. You can't be saying you're actually in favour of bringing her along, said Sanan. Saito simply shrugged. She was an asset at Ikeda. I only intended to point out that, judged by her actions, she has hardly proven a burden thus far. I could feel heat rising in my cheeks. Never in a million years would I have imagined that Saito might have a word of praise for me. Excellent, said Kondo. I will take full responsibility for your inclusion. That is, of course, if you still wish to participate. Sanan still didn't seem convinced. I looked around the room until my eyes met Okita's. Do whatever you want to do, said Okita, so long as you understand that we're going to a battle, not a party. It looked like I wasn't about to get any help from Okita. In fact, he didn't seem to care one way or the other. Well, perhaps I'd be able to help them out like I had during the Battle of Ikeda Inn. I nodded. Yes, I would like to participate. After that, everything was a blur. As quickly as we could, we prepared for battle and marched to the Fushimi Magistrate's office. There were a number of the Kyoto Judiciary Commissioner's men gathered there as well, in preparation for battle with the Choshu. Walking proudly in front of the men, Kondo approached the government official standing near the gate. We, the Shinsengumi, are reporting as requested by Lord Katamori Matsudaira, the Lieutenant General of the Aizu. Katamori Matsudaira was the Lord of the Aizu domain and also the Kyoto Military Commissioner, which made him a very important person. His name would have been immediately recognized. The man standing near the gate looked slightly taken aback at the mention of the Shinsengumi. You were told to report here? Asked the official, but we received no such orders. What? No, that didn't make any sense. Perhaps sensing my confusion, Saito leaned over and whispered under his breath. If they haven't received notice of our orders, the lines of communication are likely in disarray. We can assume, therefore, that this conflict has become rather chaotic. Chaotic? I did my best to keep my own voice at a whisper. Do you mean the Choshu is overpowering the shogunate's forces? Not necessarily, said Saito. However, I do suspect that the enemy is doing well. The Judiciary Commissioner supposedly answered to the Military Commissioner, but the Military Commissioner's office was controlled by the Aizu domain, and the Kawana domain controlled the Judiciary Commissioner's office. I didn't fully understand the relationships between the different domains, but so far as I knew, the Aizu and Kawana had never been on very good terms with one another. In other words, the situation we had found ourselves in was less than desirable. Nonetheless, said Kondo, our assistance has been formally requested. If you could only speak to your supervisor... It wouldn't make any difference, said the official. Now get out of here. We have no use for Mibu's wolves. What? How terrible! And after they'd asked for the Shinsengumi's help. I felt Harada's hand on my shoulder and turned to look up at him. Forget about them, said Harada. This isn't anything to get worked up about. We get this sort of crap all the time. But I wasn't truly a member of the Shinsengumi, but even so, it was galling. If we throw a fit here, said Harada, then we might hurt Aizu's reputation. You get it? Oh. The Kawana would only need to complain that the Shinsengumi hadn't showed them proper respect to make trouble for the Aizu. There's nothing we can do here, Chief, said Saito. We should leave the magistrate alone and meet up with the Aizu domain's men on our own. Kondo nodded in agreement, but his frown didn't fade. Yes, I agree. That is our only choice. We must look for an officer of the military commissioner. And with that, the Shinsengumi set off to find the soldiers of the Aizu domain. Night had fallen by the time we arrived at Kujo Beach. After we left the Fushimi magistrate's office, we made for the Aizu manor. Once we arrived, we related our encounter at the magistrate's office and asked for new orders. The manor official we met with directed us to go to Kujo Beach, which we did. However, What? The Shinsengumi is to join us? Said an Aizu soldier. We've received no such order. I apologize, but could you go speak to the commander at the manor? Nagakura had apparently had enough. What the hell? He was the man who told us to come here, goddammit. You wanna F us? Fine, but you're gonna be disobeying a direct order from your superior, pal. You really want to do that? The man opened and closed his mouth a few times, then fell silent. Kondo did his best to keep his voice neutral, but there was no hiding the grin that had spread across most of his face. I would like to speak to your commanding officer, if I might. Do you think you might be able to take me to him? At last, after a great deal of trouble, we were allowed to remain with the troops at Kujo Beach. The chief and the captains left the rest of us to go speak to the Aizu commanders. They returned some time later, looking tired and drained. Inoue, who'd gone with them, also wore a bitter sort of half-smile. Well, said Inoue, it would seem that the men stationed here are reserves and not the main force of their army. Their main force has been committed to the defence of Hamaguri Gate. I felt my eyes go wide. You mean they're treating the Shinsengumi like reserves? If the reserves weren't called into battle, then the Shinsengumi would never be given a chance to show their worth. Then why the hell they send us a message acting like this was some sort of emergency, said Nagakura. We can't predict what might happen, said Saito. We may be called upon to rush into battle. There's little else we can do for now. Then all we can do is wait. There was a chance we'd be called to action during the night, and so the men chose to stay awake, ready to move. Just let us know if you need to rest a bit, Chizuru, said Harada. You're always welcome to sleep on my lap. Oh no, I'm fine. Harada laughed as I shook my head. It wouldn't be fair if I was the only one who slept. The men had to remain awake and ready to act all night. At first I was far too anxious, but by dawn I was sound asleep. All around me, however, the men had kept a constant vigil all through the night. Even as I drifted in and out of sleep, I'd seen them standing or sitting nearby, alert and watchful. The sun had risen and I'd finally woken up when it happened. What? The crack of a gunshot tore through the morning air, and in the distance I heard the shouting of men and the clang of metal. The fighting had begun. The captains looked at one another and nodded. Time we left, said Saito. I stared at him for a moment, perhaps not yet fully awake, until I understood what he was saying. Right! With a quick nod I stood up and made ready to move, when... Stop! What do you think you're doing? Said an Aizu soldier. We were ordered to stay here. During our lengthy march the day before, I'd never seen Hijikata mad. He'd left the yelling to Nagakura mostly and stayed patient when it was time to speak with the army officials. But this time, perhaps he had finally had enough. I'm sorry, I thought your job here was to protect the imperial estate, but I guess you'd rather just sit around all day. We're here because we're supposed to help if those Choshu assholes attack. Tell me, what are the Choshu doing right now? But we haven't received any orders, said the soldier. Hijikata was in no mood for excuses. "If you've got any kind of pride in your job, then forget your goddamn orders and move." "Ah," said the soldier. Without even waiting for a response, Hijikata spun around and stalked off, fuming. "Where are we going?" I didn't dare raise my voice above a whisper. Saito's eyes flicked down to me for a moment and his mouth thinned almost imperceptibly. "To the enemy, which in this case means Hamaguri Gate." "Hamaguri Gate." "The battle at the gate is likely to be an intense one," said Saito. "You had best prepare yourself." "All right." Hijikata's fury seemed to have roused the Aizu soldiers as well, and they followed the Shinsengumi to the Hamaguri Gate. Before long we'd arrived. What? I'd expected a pitched battle with hundreds of men locked in combat with one another, but what we found was something else entirely. The gate itself was pockmarked with scores of bullets, and everywhere dead and dying soldiers littered the ground. The acrid stink of firearms hung in the air. What I didn't see, however, was the enemy. It seemed that we had arrived too late. The battle was already over. After a moment of stunned silence, several of our men were dispatched to determine what had happened. Kondo sighed. "What are the Choshu thinking? They've raided the imperial estate." "How can they claim to be an imperialist domain?" said Inoue. Kondo simply nodded. The Choshu had defined themselves as among those who revered the emperor, and yet they would attack his home? It didn't make sense to me either. I was pondering what motive they might have had when Saito returned. "It appears the Choshu attacked Hamaguri in the early morning, but were repelled by the combined forces of the Aizu and Satsuma. The forces standing against them had been too much for the Choshu, and they'd been forced into retreat." I saw the corner of Hijikata's mouth curl up into a grin. "So," said Hijikata, "Satsuma is helping Aizu now, are they? Times sure are changing." Right. The Satsuma and Aizu domains hadn't been on the best of terms. In fact, the Satsuma were largely nationalistic, much like the Choshu. Unlike the Choshu, however, they'd gone to war with a foreign force at one point and suffered a devastating loss. Father had told me that after that, Satsuma had begun to reconsider their nationalistic stance. "There are still some of those Choshu bastards fighting over at Kuge Gate," said Harada. Hijikata's expression changed as he considered Harada's words, but before he could open his mouth to speak, Yamazaki appeared. "Commander," said Yamazaki, "we believe the men who led this raid are headed for Mount Tenno." Although Kondo was nominally the head of the Shinsengumi, I'd learned from the men that everyone, including Kondo himself, generally deferred to Hijikata on most decisions. This was no exception, and I could see that all eyes were on him. He was silent for a few moments, and then I saw his mouth curve in a small smile. "Well, looks like we've got our work cut out for us, boys." A ripple of dry laughter ran through the men, and I could feel their excitement in the air. "Sanosuke, take your men to Kuge Gate to deal with those Choshu bastards," said Hijikata. "Sure thing, boss," said Harada. Saito Yamazaki, I want you to figure out what the situation is here. I want you to hold Hamaguri Gate." "As you wish," said Saito. "Your job's a tough one, Chief," said Hijikata. "I want you to go talk to the Aizu bigwigs." Kondo tilted his head to the side quizzically. "Some of those bastards are headed for Tenno, but some of them are just gonna run around and cause trouble," said Hijikata. "If we're gonna go after them, then we'll need to leave Kyoto, and you're the only one who can get us those papers." Of course, the Choshu were on the run now, but they could still do some damage as they fled. Pursuing them would take us outside of Kyoto, but the Shinsengumi's jurisdiction didn't extend that far. If we wanted to go after them, we'd need to get permission from the military commissioner, and that meant the Aizu. "I see," said Kondo. "If the chief of the Shinsengumi goes to speak with them, then the military commissioner's office will have to listen to what we have to say." After what we'd gone through the day before, I didn't imagine Kondo's task would be an easy one. Still, if anyone other than Kondo went, not only would the Aizu be unlikely to grant their request, there was a good chance the Shinsengumi representative wouldn't even be heard. "Again, I want you to go with him," said Hijikata. "Somebody has to keep an eye on our chief. Make sure he doesn't go crazy, all right?" "Of course," said Inoue. "I'll do my best, Commander." Another laugh ran through the soldiers, and Kondo's mouth twisted into a wry sort of grin. Perhaps he chose not to deny it because he knew he might go a little crazy. "The rest of you are coming with me to Tenno. As for you," he looked directly at me. I wasn't a warrior, and I didn't have any political skill or connections either. Hijikata didn't know what to do with me. Suddenly, I felt very much like dead weight. "You can't go with Kondo, but other than that, it's up to you," said Hijikata. "Oh, all right." It hadn't occurred to me until that moment, but he was right. Kondo was going to meet with the leaders of the Aizu. If I went with him without wearing the Shinsengumi blues, then I'd be a difficult thing to explain. Hijikata would be pursuing the leaders of the Choshu attack toward Tenno Mountain. Saito would be staying at Hamaguri Gate to protect it and to gather information. Harada and his men would be going to Kuge Gate to stop the attack on the imperial estate. The question was, where would I go? To Mount Tenno? To Hamaguri Gate? Or to Kuge Gate? And I choose to go to Mount Tenno. There was no question I would go with Hijikata and chase after Ronin, heading for Mount Tenno.